afternoon, and thank you for coming to this session on the future of the free media in Europe. I'm your moderator, Alvino Mario Fantini. Just call me Mario. It's much easier for everybody. I'm currently the editor and publisher of the European Conservative. There are copies, I think, out there. This is the latest edition. It's the summer edition. And what I'm about to say, I say not only because I'm the editor, but as a fan of magazines. I think it's a very beautiful magazine, and that is one of the objectives we try to promote. Beauty in the context of literature and politics and all the other good things, because what we're trying to do is a civilizational thing, which is to reintegrate all these things. Now, I'm going to take a few moments of this introduction to say a few comments before I go on and introduce our three wonderful panelists, okay, with your indulgence then. One of the reasons this panel is so especially important to me today, this week, this month, is because we finally were canceled. Some of you may already know this. We were canceled by our one sole stockist in London, in England actually, W.H. Smith. This happened about a month ago. They never informed us. We found out about it through some Twitter and Instagram activity, comments among various groups of far-left activists. Apparently, two members of one of these groups had walked into W.H. Smith in London, picked up one of our earlier editions, which had an interview with Viktor Orban, so obviously that equals fascism right there. And then they picked up this summer edition, which has a little cartoon, you may have already seen it, with two drawings. The first drawing shows the mother, a mother receiving her child who's coming back home from school, and she's asking him lovingly, "How was school today?" And the next drawing shows the little boy vomiting a rainbow, kind of a rainbow flag, a stream of rainbow. Obviously that, according to the activists in London, is clear signs of homophobia and hatred. So they started a whole campaign, and W. Smith removed us from their shelves. No explanation. So this week, I received a message from W.H. Smith, finally, not apologizing, nothing, just saying, "We're willing to give you another chance and put you back on our shelves, as long as you don't offend anybody else." So what does one do if one is me? Next edition, I assure you, will be the most offensive edition we've published. How many groups can we target, will be the question. If you have ideas, they're welcome. Anyway, I say all that because this topic of free media, what that means, what it looks like in Western Europe, in Central Europe, in Mitteleuropa, around the world, what does it look like? What does it mean? How do we uphold it? How do we defend it? These are critical questions. And I hope, and I know, these questions will be addressed beautifully and eloquently by these three friends. I'm very happy to call you friends. So let me introduce each of them to you. To my left is Jorge González-Gallarza, and normally I would truncate each of their bios, but I've noticed that there's some new people in this family here today, and I think you should know their backgrounds because they're very impressive. I do not have the kind of journalistic experience that these three people have. So Jorge González-Gallarza is the executive director now of Fundación Civismo. Congratulations again for that. He's also the co-host of a fantastic podcast called Uncommon Decency. He previously has worked at Manhattan Institute and Americans for Prosperity in Washington both times, right? And he studied in England and did graduate work in France. So he's a man who straddles worlds, which is wonderful. Thank you for being here. Next is Boris Kalnoky. Good to see you again. Yeah, Boris is currently the head of the media school at Matthias Corvinus Collegium in Budapest, a role that draws on his extensive experience as a journalist, primarily working for Die Welt, the German publication or daily. And in that role or in that capacity, he has served as Balkans correspondent and also, if I have it here, Middle East correspondent based in Istanbul. So fantastic experience. He's also the author of a book, and I wish I could read it, Ahnenland, Ancestral Land. It's about his family and the story of Hungary since 1952. And through that work and his experiences, again, another man who straddles worlds. Finally, Anne-Elisabeth. Hello. Good afternoon. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet is a French journalist and a columnist for The Telegraph, though her work has also appeared widely. New York Post, Unheard, Specky, other publications. She began her career, I did not know this, at VSD, Vendredi, Samedi, and Dimanche, a French weekly news and celebrity and leisure magazine. I'd love to see some of your old columns. Was it different? A different time, different...
But it was a scrappy competitor to Paris Match.
Oh, fantastic. Sounds like fun. And from there you moved on to several other publications. I have on my list François, Sunday Times, Elle, and The European, the legendary European, which is now defunct, sadly. Another person who straddles worlds. Okay, so I'll sit down and I'll throw some questions out. We'll probably start with threats, if that's fine with the panelists. Let me start. Are these on now? Thank you. Let me start with Jorge. Jorge, we hear, aside from my little anecdote, we hear of many things happening to journalists, to media institutions, especially conservative publications and things. Are things getting worse from your perspective? Are things basically stabilizing? And where do you think the greatest threat is coming from? State institutions, private sector, some kind of amalgamation of the two? What do you think?
Well, thank you, Mario. And first of all, for someone my age, I just wanted to say how delighted I am to be sharing the stage with folks who are professional role models for me in many ways, whose work I admire as journalists. So I'm really happy to be able to discuss this important topic with you all today. I'm going to try to sum up where I think the threat to press freedom is in the following way, and then I'll detail why I think this is. I think the risk right now is that press freedom used to be a measure to gauge the quality of a democracy, but increasingly is turning into a cudgel, a partisan, one-sided cudgel with which liberal governments are chastising conservative ones. And I want to detail why I think this is happening in the European Union. So for the sake of argument, I'm going to start describing several features of a country that I will not name, and then I'll try to have you guess what country I'm talking about. This country in question has slipped 3 ranks this year, from 13th to 16th in the World Press Freedom Index. This is a ranking that Reporters Sans Frontières puts out annually that scores countries on a scale from 0 to 100 based on 4 factors, based on their political context, is essentially whether the public supports the work that journalists do, holding politicians accountable, the legal framework, whether there's legal censorship, the economic context, whether newspapers are economically viable, sociocultural context, whether there are taboos, and the safety of journalists. So along those 4 or 5 criteria, the World Freedom Index scores countries on a scale from 0 to 100. And the country that I'm talking about has slipped 3 ranks this year. And the main reason for this slip is the significant rise in the number of violent attacks on journalists. You will literally not believe this, Mario, that this country has had 80 attacks on journalists in 2021 alone, primarily from neo-Nazi hooligans and other far-right groups. The Center for Media Pluralism and Freedom, which is a really interesting outlet based out of the European University Institute in Florence, publishes what it calls the Media Pluralism Monitor. And this is a really helpful tool that allows us to measure the diversity of ownership of the mediascape in different countries. And this year, this country that I'm referring to, which I have not named yet, and I want you to guess, was assessed to have a 69% risk, a 69% level of concentration in the ownership of the media. In this country, there is no threshold. There are no rules governing just how much one person can own in terms of media outlets, television stations, radio broadcasting stations. And as a result, in this country, the top 4 public broadcasters achieve a market share of 90% of television viewing time. And the top 4 newspaper publishers have a 40% share of the total circulation. So media is insanely concentrated in this country. Now, if you've paid...
I'm dying to know who this is.
Yes. If you've paid any attention to the European news cycle recently, you may think that this is, that I've just described Poland or Hungary, right? If you've been fed these sort of the standard media narratives concerning the government of Prime Minister Viktor Orban, you've heard that, you know, he is muzzling the free press. He is almost incarcerating journalists. I mean, that one has yet to be leveled against the government, but it'll come in due time. But you've heard the narrative about Hungary being, about Hungary's media being sort of owned by Orban-linked oligarchs. But the country that I'm talking about is not Hungary, and it's not Poland. It's Germany. Germany now scores lower on the World Press Freedom Index than Jamaica. And the fact that nobody, least of all the European Commission, seems to have any qualms with the lack of media pluralism in Germany goes to show the double standard which is too often applied to conservative governments in Central Europe. And I'm flanked here by my friend Boris, who can go into much further detail and show you that the portrayal that is the portrayal of Hungary as an unfree country in terms of the media is really untrue. But I just wanted to give you a few data points that show that that this notion of press freedom is increasingly turning into a cudgel, a one-sided partisan cudgel with which liberal governments are chastising conservative ones.
Jorge, I just want to say that I'm very happy by what you said, because it's a reminder that the threats aren't just radical leftists. You mentioned extreme rightists, probably racialists, some of them more, the guys from the fever swamps who are also a threat to freedom of speech. So thank you for bringing that up. I think there's a tendency to overlook that part of the political spectrum. Boris, I'd like to come to you after I go to Anne-Elisabeth with your permission, because I think what I'd like to ask you to do is to give a broader geopolitical context. Anne-Elisabeth, how about this, threats? Are we making too much of a little thing?
No, I think there are threats, but they don't come from what necessarily people say they are. I would like to add to your demonstration, until you said that there was no threshold to the ownership, you know, the share of one single individual in ownership of a media, I thought you were talking about France. But in France, we do have a threshold about ownership of media. There's a commission having to look at that. But people condemned Hungary, saying there's no media freedom, large print media groups. 3 of them belong to friends of Prime Minister Orban, and there's only one that's free, and it's got problems. Well, in France, we've got 3 media groups that belong to people who slavishly, they're businessmen, but they slavishly cater to Macronism, and essentially because that's where the contracts, or some of the contracts, or the authorization to make cross-border deals come from. And there's one solitary group, which is being accused as being fascist because it belongs to a Breton Catholic boss who lets people express themselves. He's got something which is probably more liberal than Fox News as a television channel. And in Hungary, half the media websites are opposition and half are government, and it reflects more or less what people who use the internet in Hungary does, which is not the case in France. So again, you know, we never get taken to task by the European Commission, which is a thing of beauty. But if we talk about threats to journalism, I would say that threats to journalism nowadays come in 2 shapes. And one is completely internal to newspapers and media, and it comes from the youngest generations who come in with an agenda that has been fed to them. And what I mean is that you've got younger people, usually they come from the newly revamped and refurbished and sort of amplified websites. They all have entirely different ideas about journalism, and the first thing that they want is not to be offended by anything. If you look at the New York Times it always was a liberal paper, but it was a grand paper with, you know, a dissenting opinion, but also fantastic reporting. The New York Times now, half the time, reports complete nonsense, and if you do not report complete nonsense, you do not get hired, or supposedly, if you had been hired by somebody else, you get fired. And there was, for instance, a job offer for a job of correspondent of the New York Times in India, where it was said that you were supposed to take to task the Modi government. And I was made aware of this by Indian friends who said, how is this possible? And I said, well, I don't work for the New York Times, and honestly, that's the way they run. We know perfectly well that they pushed out through a cabal of young reporters and web people an excellent reporter called Barry Weiss. She now has a Substack, which is making more than $1 million a month, so I'm very happy for her. And she's hired as a journalist, and I absolutely recommend it. It's called Common Sense with Barry, B-R-A-I, Weiss. And she left the New York Times because essentially people kept on complaining and writing letters about her to their editor and saying, you can't say that. So there's an internal danger, and that internal danger is the complete sort of breakdown of any universal principle in terms of all the news that fits to print is no longer the case in that. That comes to Europe, because whenever you say, oh, Americans do these things, it will never come here, that means 5 years. In 5 years it's happened. And at Le Monde, now they also have an internal web, an intranet. And over the intranet, they start saying, the older journalists who've written this in the paper, we don't like this, and they should not be allowed to write this. So it can go any place, and where it comes from is actually an education of the younger generations in extremely expensive universities in many places. In France, they're not expensive universities because you don't pay for tuition in France, but they are the top universities. If you take Sciences Po, if you take EHESS, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, which really used to be a fine school and still is in bits a fine school. And if you take École Normale Supérieure, another of those great fine schools in France, and if it's not physics and mathematics, which are a bit more difficult to attack, but not impossible, these people are entirely retrained in the usual suspects: critical theory, race theory. There's no such thing as justice if it's not weighted by a calculation that we make, thank you very much. And that is a threat. The other threat is a bit different, and it's a more classic threat, but it also is a threat because newspapers have got to have a nice mix of opinion and information, and if you don't have the mix, opinion in itself is nice, but it attracts readers, but it's something that needs to be based on fact. And I'm going to sort of quote a great playwright, Tom Stoppard, an English playwright who wrote years ago a wonderful play on journalism, which ought to be revived, and it's really called Night and Day. It's in 1978, and it's about foreign correspondents in an unnamed country in Africa. And one of them says, comment is free, facts are on expenses. And it is very true that facts cost money. So if you want to send out someone to Ukraine, that person has got to pay fixers, to pay a hotel, to pay a translator, to stay for several weeks being paid a salary, and to go somewhere. And it's the same thing everywhere. And whenever money is being retrenched from news organizations, the result is that you have worse papers, and those papers do not have a group of people who are confronted by reality every day because they report on it. And citizen journalists are not citizen journalists, they are activists, and there ought to be activists. I'm all for it. And we can strain all this and take the good stuff and say, well, that was made up, sorry about it. But if you don't have people trained in that, that's the worst threat on the media. And the solution is not easy, but I really advise all conservative groups to think of ways of funding independent media and then not asking them to write anything that you don't, do not look at them, just say, here is money, do and, make something of it. Otherwise, you won't have newspapers anymore.
Bravo, I love that message. And I'd like to continue that conversation on internal challenges or problems to the industry and to news in general, maybe afterwards if time allows it. I do want to point out one thing. You said about opinion journalism. It's not all opinion journalism, and true opinion journalism, the high quality version, is data driven. And Robert Bartley used to teach that everybody at the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, which I think is one of the best editorial pages in the world. But it's tops because it's driven by good research.
And if I may interject, I have friends at the Wall Street Journal on the opinion page who had letters and petitions petitions to fire them, sort of driven by the news side. And then some of the reporters on the news side, well, young people will be young. And next thing you know, Yaroslav Trofimov, that fantastic foreign correspondent who's been writing up a storm from Ukraine, he was included in a letter in which he was not orthodox enough to be acceptable by the little woke oligarchy. So the danger is really present everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Boris, I know you can opine on nearly anything under the sun here, is facing the industry, facing our industry, but let me give you some parameters. I'd like you to share with us your outlook, your opinion on the threats coming from outside the industry, that not like what Anne-Elisabeth described, but things that are coming from maybe powerful supranational institutions or organizations or even networks. Are there threats? Are there such threats? And what do they look like, and what can we do?
Well, I think the subject of today's conversation has the word future in it.
Yes.
And the near future will hold a surprise for us, or at least for people who are not in the know. There will be a new European directive to protect media freedom. And I think that is the biggest threat to media freedom, what they are preparing. Essentially, well, we all know that the internet destroyed the traditional business model of media. People don't pay for journalism anymore, so it has been ever more difficult to simply stay afloat. And now the EU wants to introduce a rule that would ban publishing houses from having any influence on their media. So if you know how the business goes, if you're a media entrepreneur, you will identify a segment in the market where you can make money. That can be women, it can be sports, but often it will be a political segment of the market. You will cater to a liberal public maybe, or a conservative public. Ideally, we believe in the media as well, in the free market, and if any segment of the population is underrepresented, then a media entrepreneur will come and will offer us let's say, a conservative or a left-wing publication. Well, that will not be possible in that sense anymore. And in my view, this will lessen the incentive for media entrepreneurs to be present on the market at all. Maybe they will build houses or do other things, but it will be very difficult to be viable as a media enterprise. So what may that leave us with? It may leave us with a world in which public media become ever more prominent. And another part of the new rule the EU is preparing is to regulate the way public media should become money and also get money, and also how government should distribute public advertising, state advertising amongst media. Now, public media, I have never come across any criticism of any government by any public media outlet ever. Have you? I don't know, certainly not in Germany. And how would this work? Not the EU would intervene directly, but let's say NGOs could sue in court in the given country and say the fact that this newspaper here has, let's say, a conservative editorial line is due to interference from its owner, and that is banned, that is forbidden. There's an EU rule that says you can't. So can you imagine the future that awaits us? And that brings me to a last thought. Anyone who has sat in on the White House press corps grilling the spokespeople of the president, or anyone who has witnessed a press conference by Viktor Orban, we journalists tend to be bloodhounds, and we ask very nasty questions. Funnily, that never ever happens when Ursula von der Leyen does a press conference, or anyone in the EU does a press conference. Have you ever seen journalists just gang up on them with really vicious questions? We will see, maybe when they introduce the Media Freedom Act.
You're just reminding me of something that I do at home. I guess it comes from my masochism, but I listen to public radio from different countries almost every day to see what they're saying. And what I've noticed is that their message, this is no surprise to most of you, coincides with whatever is hot in the political arena. So, for example, in 2020, listening to National Public Radio, which is American, United States, their language was all mildly supporting the Antifa BLM riots, exculpating that behavior. And today, it's every day there's an interview with an LGBT activist, it seems. It's incredible. So the idea that public media, broadcasting or print, is somehow going to be better for everyone because it'll be more balanced is such a lie, a blatant lie. It's incredible. So what does the industry need right now, especially from people who are in this room, people on the center right or classical liberals? What is it that we need? Do we need basically more alternatives to the corrupt or I think rotten institutions that exist in the media landscape? Or do we need more institutions, more media outlets to push back against the kind of directives and other nonsense that's coming from centers of power? What is it that we need? Does anybody want to jump in, or should I just call on somebody?
I'm going to repeat myself. We need money. We need money and investors who possibly, the best thing that a state can do to help free media, and they say they're all for free media, all of them, is to possibly say, give tax breaks to people investing in investors, not just newspapers and other things have got tax breaks already, at least in my country and elsewhere. But give tax breaks to investors in media, because the media ecology, as Boris so well pointed out, has become much more difficult now that it's internet-driven. But what there needs to be is creative destruction of the unfit, and help in general to sort of create new ones, because journalists, we are crazy, as I'm sure the three of us who are actually working journalists, or were working journalists, know we are crazy, but we like our job. It is not a job that pays very well. It is a job that has insane hours. But essentially, it's more fun than working for a living. So we do that. We're fascinated about it. We're passionate about the way we do it. You can really argue about things like the Oxford comma. Do you put a comma after the preposition and?
Love that debate. I love it.
Well, we can have a debate on this one, but anyway, you can have a long debate about the Oxford comma and other things. We love writing, we love style, we love substance, we love people who do the job well, and then you get people, and it's an accretion of people that you put together like lots of grains of salt in a mega oyster, and something good comes out or not. And so that's what you need. You need more of them, and some of them will be enough heroic failures that actually people will remind them after 20 years after they've tanked. That's how good they used to be. And if you think at what was known in America as the new journalism, almost all the media where that was born do not exist or have changed, but it doesn't matter. It seeds new journalists who will find different ways of doing what we like doing. And what journalists want to do out of life is write well about things that are true and make you understand things that you didn't know before. There are other ignoble reasons for becoming a journalist. I've known enough people who basically wanted to meet famous people, and there are a bunch of reporters who just want to report the news, and it's the motley crowd of strange individuals that makes up good journalism. And the other thing about good journalism is people want to read it. You don't have to force them to read it. People want to go to the website. People want to read it. If you build, what you want from your readers is, if they haven't got, online to your paper or bought your paper or magazine and read it, they feel something is missing in their lives. And that's what you want to foster.
Thank you. So money. So we need a George Soros or a Peter Thiel or an Elon Musk, better said, I think. And what else besides money, Boris?
No,
please.
money, but not in the way Anne-Elisabeth is saying. We need success on the market, which is what the media have always needed. For the media to be successful on the market in these very difficult economic conditions of the digital age, we need fair market conditions. Now, public media are distorting competition, and one thing you might want to introduce is a ban on public media appearing in writing. Just limit them to television and radio. That be public media, but don't let them have websites which do not cost money, and thus cost the private media money, because people will go there, they don't need to pay, and they have the feeling they are informed. So that would be one thing.
But you would ban the BBC website?
Sorry?
You would ban the BBC website?
I would not ban the BBC website. I would limit public media to radio and television, certainly in Germany. I don't really gain much from rereading on the internet what they have been doing on television, and also their news sites do not give me much added value. But certainly it takes away market shares from private media a lot. They appear at press conferences. There was just an event in Germany, and the public media appeared with, I don't know, 34 correspondents. That's just German public media, and any private media outlet would be there with one correspondent. They have the money to do that. They are financed by taxes that everyone has to pay, irrespective of the quality of the information they are getting. That is unfair. This is distorting the market for private media.
Okay. One
I
final
might
word
disagree,
on that.
but yeah.
Okay.
But it's incidentally, it is good to disagree. That's how you get good media.
Can I follow up, Boris, if you don't mind, just on something? I fully agree that perhaps instead of finding that one wealthy individual or a group of individuals to do charity and set up something, or a private pool of capital, it has to be market viable. Our new outlets, our new publications have to survive on the market. But the nature of how people read and what they're reading is shifting and changing. So does that mean that we have to adapt what we're doing? I mean, people are reading less, for example. Maybe I'll throw it to Jorge if you don't mind, and then you can jump back in. Do we stop writing so long and so much and start doing more videos?
Yes, and I think you're turning here to sort of the future, the more future-oriented question, and I do think that one of our main responsibilities is going to have to be to stand athwart the trend towards viral news. We're going to have to remain focused on writing long-form pieces, long essays. This is one of the reasons why I love the Eurocon. I'm really, I mean, as a millennial myself, I have to say I despair seeing my fellow 20-somethings struggle to keep their eyes on an article for more than 30 seconds. It's really dispiriting. But I wanted to maybe go to tie this into your earlier question about what it is that we need, and Anne-Elisabeth is sort of begins and ends with money, and I do think that's part of the answer. But I think we have to know what it is we want that money to fund, and I always go back to talent. I mean, I think this is one of the things that our movement is in need of. I mean, in 1970, William F. Buckley told Playboy magazine that Playboy magazine rather asked William F. Buckley what he thought was the main obstacle facing the conservative movement at the time, 1970, and he said, a scarcity of good writers and journalists. A scarcity of good writers and journalists. I think that is still the case today. That is actually one of the main successes of the European conservative. If you follow the growth of Mario's magazine over the past year and a half or so, you will have noticed that Eurocon publishes reliably good content every time, and particularly from people that you had not heard before, which tells you that Mario's been really good at identifying people with talent and promoting their work on the magazine. People like Harrison Pitt, people like Hélène de Lausanne. These are names I'd never even heard of myself. You may not know them, but what I can guarantee you is if you go and if you start reading Eurocon, print and online, you will not be dissatisfied.
Thank you for that, Jorge. And by the way, he's not my PR agent, so thank you.
No, I'm just a reader of the magazine. But I just want to expand a little bit more on this issue of recruitment because Mario, I know you went through a couple of Stanton Evans' programs in Washington. This is and on the other side of the Atlantic, this is done by institutes such as National Review Institute, the National Journalism Center. These institutes have decades of experience promoting and recruiting journalists to be placed at other news organizations. I know the Koch brothers have been doing this for a while in partnership with the Poynter Institute. One of the awesome things that they do, having been through some of those programs myself, is that you apply to one of their fellowships and they place you at a news organization to work there for a year and learn the trade, right? How to report a story, how to build sources, how to write in AP style, how to edit. So this is what, I mean, this reminds me of what Washington Post publisher Phil Graham said of journalism. He said that journalism was a rough first draft of history. And that is a heck of a responsibility. That's a lot of weight on your shoulders. And we need to be recruiting the people and instilling, or rather, cultivating the skills to succeed in journalism. I think the launch of the Eurocon has really been a milestone. I think the movement, certainly the European conservative movement, did not really quite have a venue where its debates could be hashed out until Mario came along with his magazine. And I know, and this, at the risk of sparking a sort of intra-panel fracture here between Mario and Boris, because I do know that these gentlemen disagree on something which is, I think, fundamental to this discussion, which is, I remember in Budapest last year, Mario said, Boris, we need to train conservative journalists, and Boris said, no, we need to train journalists, and I think this is a really important point. Look, I think. I'm going to try to chime into that question by saying that, yes, we need to cultivate the skills of independent reporting, but the issues on which you choose to report are partly a political choice. And I think one of the things that I'm really hoping that Eurocon can do more of is to have some of the investigative reporting in Brussels working to unveil and uncover some of the malfeasance, the corruption of our political rivals on the left, the NGocracy. There's really, really a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Boris.
Just for the record, I never said no. I said it's something I cannot help with because I wasn't trained to be a conservative journalist. I come from the mainstream media, and but the old school, in good old times, mainstream media, and we were trained to report what's going on, and that's it, inform our readers. Now, you make an essential point. Obviously, one needs to attract talent, but it's difficult if there's no business model, and you cannot offer them a career perspective. So we have to have market success for private media that will attract talent, and we need market conditions that are fair. Obviously, one other thing is our own mistake in the media. We have become alienated from our readers. We should reconsider. We work for them, and only if we do that will they be ready to pay for the product we offer them. In fact, a well-regarded German tabloid journalist, Ralf Schuler, of Bild-Zeitung, is now quitting there because he can't stand it anymore. They've become too woke, he says. He wrote a book about it. He wrote, the title is Let's Be Populists, and he said, if we do not take into account what people actually think in society, what they think and feel, if we do not reflect that in our writings, in our choice of subjects that we cover, we will starve because no one will be interested in our product. We need to go back to the reader. We need to understand what moves people. We need to write about that and less about ideologies.
That feeds into something I've been thinking about for a while for our own project. I mean, if for any of you have seen the journal or the website, you know that it's at a high level, but not everybody wants to read an essay on Carl Schmitt's influence on the Chilean Constitution of 1973, for example. I know, it's surprising, right? So I keep thinking of, the European conservative fills a need, and it has its niche or niche. But something else is needed, right, to reach a broader population, to reach the people who are resentful of the ruling elites in Brussels or Washington or wherever, to reach just the average person who doesn't have time to read such an essay on deep philosophy or Kojève or something, but who wants to be informed. So it tells me that there's a need for new products out there, as has already come up. Let me go to you, and then I'll see if there's any questions from the audience. But so besides money, Anne-Elisabeth, what else do we need? And besides the human resources and the talent and a good business model, something else, or is that the magic three?
It's very difficult because, like Boris, I come from the mainstream media, and I didn't even go to journalism school. I read history at university, which actually turns out to be not a bad thing to read if you want to become a journalist. But essentially, I just wanted to do this because, as I said before, more fun. And fun is a strange word, but it's also a word that describes what moves people at the end of the day. That's the main motivator, is do I want to do this? So what we ought to do also is to try and sort of reflect on what the role of the media is in a world, the world that we'd like, a world with conservative values upheld, with freedom, with people who are allowed to disagree with us, whom we will not denounce and fire, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, how do we sort of spark this fun, because that fun will be felt by the readers. And it's very difficult. It's a dark art. I've said, you said in an instant, I know that there are people who don't want to read long form. I would like to argue, by the way, that there are also some of the greatest successes in today's journalism is long form. And it's the New York Times caters to a narrow, I hope, segment of American opinion, but it's doing better now that it's become so appallingly partisan. There's a lesson in this. It's not necessarily pleasing, but it's a fact. And there are people who want to read 2,000 words on something really interesting, and there's a niche for that. So it's more a question of variety and seeing how we can foster this variety. I don't have recipes saying, somebody's going to come from the skies and find it for us. So it's more a question of possibly, as journalists, the journalist ought to get out to the schools and tell them, look, they will tell you that it's important, and it is. They will tell you that it's about civic rights, and it is. They will tell you that you as citizens ought to be informed to decide how you're going to vote and just what you're going to do in the shops when you go buy something that's twice as expensive as last week. But at the end of the day, you have to tell them, if you work hard enough, it will be serious fun. And I think that's the most important thing you can give people.
Just a word to add to that. And indirectly, it sort of comes out of what you've just said. But one other very important thing in the very difficult business environment the media have now is media entrepreneurship. So it doesn't matter what quality we produce as journalists, if the entrepreneur does not understand the market and the technology. It took years at Die Welt to understand that we need reach and we need subscriptions. So if we see that a specific article has generated 100,000 clicks, then we put a paywall and not before. So we have the reach, but we will also have the subscriptions. These kind of things don't come easy. It took a while for the business managers at Axel Springer to understand that if we fire half of the journalists and replace them with social media technicians and internet technicians, this will make the model work, actually, and this is what happened. They need to enhance their online presence with subtle methods, but it takes money, and you have to actually replace some of the journals and have specialists on board, and then the media mix, the long form pays, but celebrities also pay. Lifestyle advice also brings money, so it needs to be a mix. And again, for that, you need the media entrepreneur to understand the business model.
But I'd like to answer Boris, because I think it's really important. Is you come from a world of plenty, because Germany is a rich society. Newspapers, there are lots of journalists, and Germany also happens to be, and you can correct me, a conformist society largely. So it needs to be shaken up. But when you've got people who work on a shoestring, it's different. But what you said about entrepreneurs...
Don't shake up Germany, it never ends well.
But it's...
Don't poke the bear.
But what we really need is to have, possibly to train the entrepreneurs or to attract the entrepreneurs saying, come this way. And seminars on explaining this is how you create a media and, attracting them. That if we need...
Maybe we can ask the EU to train media entrepreneurs and then the problem will be solved.
I'm sure there's a pool of funding for that.
Irony.
Jorge, anything to add, Jorge, before I might... Okay, does anyone in the audience have questions for the panelists? Gentleman over there with his hand raised. Maybe we can get him a mic. Thank you.
Just the last footnote to Elisabeth. We will have a big publishing conference at Matthias Corvinus Collegium November 30th and December 1st to address that specific question on how can we be successful on the market as media entrepreneurs.
I'm not doing this at Bulgarian, I'm there.
Good. Would you mind identifying yourself and your organization as well?
Yeah, hi. I'm Tuomas Malinen, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Helsinki. I have a question for the panel on the media reporting during the corona pandemic, especially during the vaccination campaigns. Because I cannot really describe them in any other form or shape or form than a pure propaganda. For example, us unvaxxed people in Finland were hunted quite relentlessly. At point, they even called us this was from a private media, called us a genocidal idiots. And this part of my friends is vile crap that we really had to put up with. And it spread all over Europe, it seems, at least looking from Finland. So I would like to have your opinion that how it went, because for me at least, it seemed that the kind of the hunt of the unvaxxed were participated, both the private and the government sponsored media participated on that.
Okay, moderator accepted. Let's just go down the line. Is that okay? Yeah.
Well, I hope this is going to address sort of parts of your question, if not the entire question itself. But I think the pandemic put many different aspects of our media ecosystem to the test. I mean, I still remember when this was also yet another case of a double standard being applied to Hungary, when Prime Minister Orban got Parliament to approve an emergency law that somewhat curtailed press freedoms, right, marginally. It was reported on as being a big infringement on press freedoms, when in Spain, for instance, an even tougher law actually was applied, was passed. And the only reason no one ever heard of Spain doing the same is because we have a left-wing government and Orban is a right-wing monster. So that is one of the ways where I think the pandemic really put media to the test. But maybe our panelists have other insights.
Boris.
I understood the question to be about the media coverage of COVID vaccinations and how there was a kind of uniformity in reporting, right? All I can tell you as an anecdote is how it went at Axel Springer. It looked a lot like everywhere else, and then it started to fray, and there were articles about maybe it's not so good. We're losing freedoms here as citizens, and it's a big thing. We should not just take it without thinking. And then specifically at Bild-Zeitung, they were beginning to get somewhat tougher in their reporting, and the editor-in-chief driving that reporting was ousted after SMS were leaked between him and the CEO of the company. Now here we go again with the new EU directive. You should not, as a CEO, etc., etc. Where the CEO said the way we're treating this is beginning to resemble the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, the then communist Eastern Germany. Julian Reichelt, the editor-in-chief of Bild-Zeitung at the time, was then ousted. There were other reasons. He had been womanizing. But anyway, that reaction to oust the person driving the more critical reporting on COVID vaccination came from within, actually. It came from within, published from within the newspaper, and young colleagues with a more leftist outlook on things conspired, as it were, to have him ousted.
Okay, thank you. Anne-Elisabeth, anything?
Are we talking coverage?
It was the coverage, right, that you're interested of the COVID and the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I have problems with the entire way that the vaccines came and started being doubted, because it seemed that what we were all suffering, at least in Western Europe, is the refusal of any kind of risk. And any scientific endeavor and any human endeavor has an element of risk. And we knew that the proportions of people who reacted badly to the vaccines were very small. There were studies on this. It was actually, people said it has not been tested. It had been tested on millions of people every day. And so I don't know what you would sort of, I didn't quite hear what you said in terms of what you had, the issue you had with the coverage. But I didn't think that the coverage that I've seen was peculiarly biased. I'm quite willing to give a lot of slack to the leaders of my country or any country when they face something that they have not seen before and they've got to react as fast as possible. If anything, the risks that were taken in France were rather risks of giving a leeway to doubt about vaccines, because our government and officials, who in France never speak without the okay of their hierarchy, because they had France had not managed to produce a vaccine in time for various reasons, which I can talk to you over coffee afterwards, made that they looked at the British leader. Britain was the leader in getting the vaccine distributed as fast as possible, and that was one of Boris Johnson's finest hours, and he hasn't got so many that we can't remember that. And the result was the French were incredibly chary to talk about it, and I remember debating on French television a woman who has a high post at INSERM, which is the National Institute for Medical Research, and who said, "Oh no, we're not going to do like les Anglais, we're going to do this very slowly and we'll start later, and we're not going to do many in order to see whether there are side effects." The responsibility of that woman in terms of essentially giving oxygen to the anti-vax movement, to me, was something terrifying, and it was I would say that the press gave what she said because she was saying something, and therefore it was broadcast. Plus, it was a live debate. But that would have been, the problem to me came to the general fear of our leaders, first of all, to be sued for having done something wrong. I don't think there should be any kind of judicial vendetta against politicians for decisions that they took in good faith. If they put their hand in the till, obviously you send the judges to them. But if they tried to do their best and sometimes they got it wrong, I'm not going to hold it against them, because this is life. We're not voting gods in. But that, to me, was the main problem about that coverage, and it was not due to the journalist, it was due to our government.
Anything else to add to that? Okay. Other questions from the audience, perhaps? Please. And again, if you don't mind stating your name and organization.
Simon Sarevsky from the Austrian Economic Center. So my question is, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? In a sense, we cry, let's say, on our side of the political spectrum, we cry about the cancel culture, the woke, let's say the woke cancel culture, but what comes first? Is society changing so much and companies are fostering to society changing, or is it the other way around? Because then I would say that the problem comes with us if society is changing and we either don't like the change and think it's wrong, or for whatever reason. So again, what comes first? Society changing, or is it some sort of like a conspiracy theory I don't know, from the universities or from the big guy or whatever?
I'm not sure you can sequence things, but go ahead, Jorge, please.
And the question is whether the chicken or the egg comes first in the media changing.
Yes, and especially with the cancel culture that is happening in the past 10 years. Something similar, I would say, is, so for example, with the war in Ukraine, I would say companies are putting the Ukrainian flag not because they are against war, against Putin, against whatever, just because they will sell more products that way. Similar thing, I would say, is the rainbow flag during the Pride Month. So that's at least my opinion. So what I would say is culture is changing so much. So what we are seeing is not like a big, let's say, conspiracy of sorts, but like companies accepting, even Facebook or Twitter, accepting that the society is changing so much, so they just want to make more money, and that's why we see woke going global?
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think, well, I think in many respects, I wish that our corporate and media elites actually did reflect the society which they serve. Because I think that oftentimes you speak of kind of the woke culture that is being sort of preached from on high, and I think that so you wouldn't have that in sort of offline. You wouldn't have many people being canceled for their right-wing views if the companies weren't actively allowing for that censorship. I think it starts with the companies want to virtue signal that they're keeping conservatives in check, and that's where the censorship comes from. That's how I would look at it. But it's a really interesting question. Actually.
I think you're eager to say something about this.
Well, first of all, I think it is a wonderful question because it's open-ended, and just as the joke about the chicken and the egg, it really is open-ended because that's the question that we should ask about practically anything. In terms of woke culture and just woke culture, I think there's a disconnect between the adoption of woke by a small minority of extremely privileged people. And there's a really good book by a woman called Batia Ungar-Sargon. I don't know how to pronounce it. She's an American. Obviously, there must be some Hungarians in the mix with that wonderful name. But she's written about the fact that it is a denial of the privileged class in America to acknowledge the fact that they can send their kids to schools that cost $50,000, $60,000 a year, tuition in universities that cost even more, and that more and more the world is geared so that if you do not have this privileged education, you get lower jobs, lower life expectancy. I mean, your entire life is different. This explains, by the way, lots of things about American politics and who votes for populist leaders. It's a disconnect in which the privilege was not acknowledged. I mean, I myself, as a conservative, say we need more Marxism in here. We need to talk about class struggle. It would be much more interesting to talk about something actually sort of solid, like the fact that some people have worse lives than others. We just differ about the solutions. But I think in that specific respect, there is a combination of adoption by a small elite of something that validates them as being the righteous, and it absolutely coincides with the time when the left abandons the people. Like many conservatives, I was mugged by reality in my life, and I started off as a rabid lefty. I have a family who are socialists in France, not communists, absolutely against it, but and I evolved towards conservatism. I remember as a child being told, respect the working class, respect people who are poorer, you owe them something. And it is the combination, the evolution of two things which are both very strong in France, the Catholic Church and a Marxist thought. And it was not such a bad basis, and then you find different solutions than the solutions they advocate. In this case, I think woke came first. It came from a small group, and it took over. And then you take over what I was saying about risk. Companies are terrified of reputational risk, and they immediately caved in because they felt, oh my God, our life is destroyed on Twitter, and so we can't do that. And it's really American, and like everything American, which I said before, it then comes to us. It's fascinating that a company was asked to present excuses in America because at a private seminar of executives, somebody made jokes about nationalities. Is one of those maps when you talk about Germans and you say cars, and you talk about the Spaniards and you say siesta, and all of this is supposedly mildly offensive, but they're jokes and they don't mean anything. The company was led by an Austrian boss. It's Red Bull, the energy drink, and he was supposed to fire all these people and to apologize, and he said, no, I'm not going to do this, because he came at the time, it's a few years, from a different culture in Europe, and essentially his considered answer to the people who demanded such abject apologies was to say, are you nuts? And nothing happened to Red Bull. People keep drinking it. So, there can be pushback.
Excellent example, thank you. Other questions? Oh, yes, I can barely see you. Ian.
Ian Martin from Reaction outlet in the UK. I think the point about class is absolutely central to this. And isn't it really a function of graduates taking over the media? the great John O'Sullivan, who's in the audience, when John worked on the Daily Telegraph, it would have been predominantly run by people who hadn't been to university. It was a breeding ground for autodidacts.
Had not. Sorry.
It was a breeding ground for autodidacts who didn't go to university but went through journalistic on-the-job training. And it meant that newspapers then surely were very connected to their readers, the majority of which in those days didn't go to university. So I think you make a brilliant point. My question is, how do you change it?
Well, it parallels what's happened to other sectors of society too, right? Foreign policy, all Princeton grads, at least in the United States, it seems, it's happened across the world in different spheres. Go ahead, Jorge.
And I wanted to, maybe Anne-Elisabeth can also elaborate a little bit on the book she just mentioned, but it was a really fantastic book by Bation Sargon, Bad News. And one of the points she makes in the book is that when these elite graduates of Ivy League colleges took over the mainstream media outlets, they started using the culture wars over race as a way to hide the culture wars about class. And it was used as a way to sort of, as a fig leaf, to obscure the fact that they were not representative of the wider society. They come from, they're a tiny sliver of society from some of the wealthiest and most privileged families in America. And in order to sort of legitimize themselves, they turn to the issue of race. So I guess that sort of...
And what I would suggest is that the unions in Britain said you have to work in a provincial newspapers for 2 years before you can come to a national newspaper. I don't want to resurrect the old unions on Fleet Street. I used to work for the Sunday Times, and the arrival of Rupert Murdoch liberated that paper. And I know it's a disputed opinion, but still. However, I suspect that it would be good for every young person who wants to be a journalist to work on a tabloid for a bit. Whether Bild-Zeitung or The Sun, because the instincts are fantastic, and these are places that are mercifully free of all the influence of the elite organizations. It would do them a great deal of good because they would see professionals at work.
Thanks. Anything to add, Boris?
I think that's a great point, Anne-Elisabeth. I would just like to return to what I said about public media, because I sensed not outrage, but not understanding what am I speaking about at all. And I would invite you to go back in time and imagine a world where we do not have the internet. We have print, television, and radio. And in that world, we have the Telegraph, the Independent, the Times. And in television and radio, we have the BBC. And all of a sudden, a daily broadsheet newspaper appears on the market. Its title is the BBC. It's taxpayer funded. What do you think would happen with the other newspapers?
But it exists. It's The Guardian.
All right. But you do get my point. The equivalent of that is today's webpage.
I get your point, and I know I can see that. I'm French, and our public media is, of course, as left-wing as the BBC, because that's the way public media rolls. But it's not terribly good, so it's not as bad competition as Deutsche Welle or the BBC. But so I beg to be excused out of this one.
I don't think you're satisfied by that response. What, anything to add? Any other questions from the audience? We have a few minutes left. Rodrigo Gomez.
Hello, I'm Rodrigo. I'm the editor of a conservative digital magazine called Revista Centinela. Thank you very much for such an interesting panel. And my question is, with the loss of credibility of the mass media, do you think there is an opportunity for conservative journalism through the figure of independent journalism? I mean, a conservative journalist that only through his social media and newsletter can make a living and have a real impact on society.
Please.
Yeah, sure. We see it on Substack that conservative journalists who have been unloved by their by their home newspapers where they used to work. They go on Substack and do have an impact actually on the national conversation. And we have something similar but it's not limited to conservative views. Independent means you don't get money from anyone but your readers or your market or whatever. That's the only thing that independent means. It doesn't mean your opinion is this or that. It's just financial. Now, conservative, yes, there's a conservative readership out there, and you can make money by banking on that market. There's, any election will show that half of society is conservative. If that is being underrepresented in the media, this means it's a chance for media entrepreneurs or even single journalists nowadays, with the help of the internet on Substack, to make a living.
Jorge, what do you
Yes,
think?
and I think I actually really encourage everyone here to check out Revista Centinela. And I think the answer, kind of at the risk of repeating myself, is I think conservative outlets have to find a niche, or else have a very a concrete plan to reach a very large audience and to fund your operation off of that readership. But I think one of the things that Centinela does is you found that sort of niche, which is a very highbrow, cultural kind of journalism. And I think if it's succeeding now, and if you've got if you've got a sort of a readership, then stick to your alley, stick to your lane, do what you know best. Keep your readers satisfied. I think that is always the recipe for success in journalism.
Quick question to you, Jorge. Do you think anyone like Rodrigo contemplating or currently engaged in one of these alternative online media sites should necessarily look beyond print or text and do audio video? I mean, should we all be what they call backpacker journalists who can do several things at the same time?
Well, I was, yes, and let me maybe give a personal example with some of the challenges that I'm facing at Civismo, at the think tank I'm with. I was having a conversation with another Spanish friend and who said, look, if you're going to be putting out content on behalf of your think tank, at least half of it has to be audiovisual. Right, people don't just want to be reading a newsletter. People, if you're going to be sharing a newsletter, there's got to be some video on it, or there's got to be image. So I think yes, and I think that's also one of the projects that Eurocon has also taken on, the audiovisual element. Right, I mean, doing interviews, doing short clips, doing all of that helps. Keep the reader, and again, we're visual. We're primarily visual. This is if you're scrolling through a piece or a newspaper, and if there are pictures or video, you're going to be more interested. So I think audiovisual is an absolute must.
Yeah, you need to have these skills, but it's not limited to upstarts. Everyone in the media needs to have these skills now. Mainstream media, just the same. In fact, if you apply as an apprentice journalist at Axel Springer today, you have to apply with video content as well, not just writing.
Thank you. Final word.
Okay, fine. Well, the Telegraph used to be the most fuddy-duddy of newspapers in London, and still under the new editor, in the past few years, they've developed television. They've done, long interviews, short interviews, video, podcasts, Twitter Spaces, which are those conversations on Twitter, and it has not only has it developed, readers or consumers who would not have come for something else, but as journalists, it has made us sort of more aware of sort of faster way of interacting, which I think is also good in our old-fashioned writing. So overall, it's good to go. It's like the swimming pool, go and jump.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, thank you for this past hour.